Very well.
Brian O'Neill heads up the nonprofit Insurance Institute. It's funded by large auto insurance companies whose goal is to make cars safer. Why would the insurance companies care so much that they would fund this multi-million-dollar building?
We are trying to push car design so that they are better, so that there will be fewer injuries, fewer claims, fewer medical bills, which will benefit us all.
There's no doubt new cars today are safer than ever. Automakers have made vast improvements. Seatbelts and airbags are saving lives. But as you'll see tonight, some cars may not be as safe as you think. The Institute says with belts and airbags working, now it's time to focus on crippling leg injuries.
I hit the brakes real hard, but it was too late.
Donald Fazenbaker was in a head-on crash in December. A few years ago, he might have been killed. Now seatbelts and an airbag saved his life. But there's more to his case.
This is the bottom of his right foot. He had a fracture of his heel bone.
Dr. Andrew Burgess was the trauma surgeon on duty.
He had a fracture in the ankle joint right here. He had a fracture in the middle of his tibia or shin. His knee had no major injury. And between his knee and his hip joint, his thigh bone was fractured in several places. So he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 injuries between the central part of his body and his foot.
And his other leg? It was severely broken too.
I had a skin graft on this leg. The bottom part of my body wasn't protected.
And because injuries like Donald's keep happening, the Institute wondered whether the government safety test tells the whole story.
This is the government's crash test.
For more than 20 years, the government has been crashing cars like this, straight on into a wall, a good way to test airbags and seat belts.
You see the bags working very well, the dummies, the movement is well controlled.
This car passes the government test.
Passes it with flying colors.
The problem, O'Neill says, more than half of all real-world crashes don't happen that way. Walk through any junkyard and you'll see cars that hit off-center. And if you test that way, like the Institute is doing, in a way the government doesn't, the results can be alarmingly different. Once again, this is how the government test looks.
This is the same car you just saw in the government test in our test, the Mitsubishi Galant. Look at the difference in its performance.
Incredible.
All of the cars are doing well in the government test now, but they're not all doing well in this test.
What's the difference? In the government's test, the force of the crash is absorbed evenly across the full front of the car. In an off-center crash, or offset as it's known, the force is concentrated on just one side. O'Neill says although these pictures look shocking, the worst injury in this offset crash was not what you actually see. Once again, the seatbelt and airbags help protect the head and chest, but the impact drove the foot pedal area, the footwell, 12.5 inches back toward the dummy's legs and feet. The Institute says if this dummy had been a real person, he would not have walked away. At least one leg would have been broken.
In the offset collision.
And it's not just the Institute that is concerned. One of the world's most respected automakers has been warning for years that without offset testing, the government's program is flawed. Tom Beloga is a safety engineer for Mercedes-Benz.
In an offset impact, you would have much more movement rearward because you're doubling the crash energy on the side of the vehicle that's impacted. And that was jamming rearward and causing injuries.
In fact, even this U.S. government study obtained by Dateline suggests if you are wearing a seatbelt, offset collisions produce a higher likelihood of serious to fatal injuries than full frontal crashes. But the government doesn't require offset crashes, so up until now, consumers had no way of knowing which cars will put you in that kind of crash. The Insurance Institute is starting to change that. Dateline was invited to watch the first ever set of comparative offset crash tests. Dummies are precisely positioned in the cars. A special grease paint is applied, different colors for different parts of the body.
This way we can tell where shin impact was on the dashboard.
Connections to more than 24 data channels inside the dummy checked and double-checked. A computer will record the forces on the head, chest, and legs. This computerized arm will measure exactly how much the driver's compartment is crushed, how much the footwell is driven into the legs. The Institute bought the brand new cars right off dealers' lots. Each car will be tested at the same speed, the same angle, the same conditions. Dateline had no say on how the cars were chosen, tested, or evaluated.
Charging.
The car being tested, the 1995 Volkswagen Passat.
What are the legs looking like? They're a
left
little high.
lower.
The Institute's high-speed film shows what happens in a test designed to simulate two cars colliding in an offset crash at about 38 miles an hour.
The C-tracks failed. You can't see the right foot.
The footwell area near the pedals is driven 14 inches back toward the dummy's legs.
One bad leg?
Yeah.
So it's
we may have
a
clipped
real
it.
bad left leg result.
The numbers indicate a high risk the left leg and ankle are broken. This car, the new Chrysler Cirrus, meets government standards and is Motor Trend magazine's Car of the Year.
3, 2, 1.
The Chrysler Cirrus was one of the worst performers.
As you watch the slow motion, remember, this test is designed to simulate a real-world crash at 38 miles an hour. The seat belts and airbag protect the head and chest, but what you can't see is the damage to the legs.
The center console has come over on the right side of his right foot.
The dummy is trapped, and the computer readings indicate high risk that both legs are broken. We took the Cirrus offset test to the man in charge of the government's crash testing program. Dr. Ricardo Martinez heads NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. This crash caused the footwell to move in 15.5 inches, and the dummy appears to have broken legs and broken feet.
Correct, and that's a real problem with real-world crashes.
Which would lead people to wonder, why doesn't the government do offset testing?
Well, we're very concerned about it. We think it's an important issue. We applaud the Insurance Institute for doing this sort of test. We think it's an important test. We just don't have the money right now to do that.
But it's not just whether the government should be doing a new test. The Institute's findings raise questions about whether the information the government is handing out about the test it already does is misleading.
That foot looks in a very bad position.
Every year, NHTSA releases a list, like this, rating car safety. The more stars, the safer the car.
5 stars is the highest you can get in our ranking system. It means that given that category of car, that it is the, quote, safest car and the one that performed the best.
I'm quoting from your own guidelines here. 5 stars means a 10% or less chance of serious injury.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Let's look at one of your 5-star cars, the Ford Contour.
Now that's interesting. You notice that because of that offset, there's a little bit of motion this way.
Dateline showed Dr. Martinez the Institute's offset crash test and its analysis of what happened.
Performed very poorly, major intrusion. If you look at the footwell here, you see it's actually tearing and ripped apart in there.
Tell me realistically, what would happen to somebody's feet if they were in this car?
So this is a crash where someone could not walk away. This is a crash where you'd have major injuries, breaks, dislocations to both legs, both feet.
This car gets 5 stars on the government's test.
That's misleading. This car is not that good compared to other similar cars.
Is the government's 5-star system in this case misleading?
Well, again, we think we can do better. There were low extremity injuries and one that we have not taken into account in the star rating. The rankings for the 5 stars are based upon the head and chest criteria.
But consumers don't know that.
No, they don't.
I assume that means my whole body, not just my head.
Well, that would be a wrong assumption, wouldn't it? I mean, right now we're looking at head and chest, but what this car test shows is there's more at stake than just your head and chest.
Buddy, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
So is it possible to produce cars that do well in both tests? The Institute says it's not only possible, it's found several cars that already do.
Clear the runway.
The 1995 Ford Taurus gets high marks in the government's test, and it passes the Institute's test too.
The safety cage is held together very well.
The dummy's head and chest aren't injured, and neither are the legs.
They're good numbers. Much better than most of the cars tested so far.
And it isn't just Ford. Although General Motors sent us a letter saying designing vehicles to perform well in the Insurance Institute's test could increase the risk of head and chest injuries, one of its cars did well in the offset test. Watch what happens when the Institute tests a GM car that also has the best possible rating from the government.
This is the Chevy Lumina, one of the best performers. Look at the difference. Very little intrusion in the footwell area. This was one of our standout cars.
Proof, O'Neill says, that cars can protect the head and chest and the legs. Tomorrow, the Institute will release a full ranking of all 14 cars it tested, based on structural damage to the car, how much the dummy moved, and injuries. 3 cars are rated good in the offset crash test overall: the Chevy Lumina, the Ford Taurus, and the Volvo 850. The Institute ranks 4 cars as acceptable: Toyota Camry, Subaru Legacy, Honda Accord, and the Mazda Millenia. 1 car, the Saab 900, gets a marginal rating. 6 cars get an overall rating of poor from the Institute: the Mitsubishi Galant, the Chevrolet Cavalier, the Chrysler Cirrus, the Volkswagen Passat, the Nissan Maxima, and the Ford Contour. But listen to this. According to the government's rating system, those 3 cars got high safety ratings, 4 and 5 stars. But in all 6 of the cars the Institute calls poor in the offset test, if the dummy had been a person, he would have had a broken leg or a broken foot.
There's some cars that are doing well in the government's test, very well in the government test, that are just doing disastrously in this test.
If companies were to start to design cars to pass your test rather than the government's test, would that make cars less safe in a strictly head-on collision?
Not necessarily so, but it would be a mistake if they did that. They should be designing their cars to do well in both tests.
What do the automakers have to say? Well, the companies that make all 6 of the cars rated poor declined to comment on camera, most saying they needed more time to study the results and that it's a mistake to read too much into one crash test. Ford and Chrysler wrote us that the test speed was too high. Ford said the Institute is not impartial, and Chrysler said it ought to be up to the government to set testing standards. GM said damage to cars doesn't always mean injury, and there was too much emphasis on broken legs, not enough on its top priority, protecting the head and chest. And finally, the automakers stressed these points. They care about safety, have made huge investments to try to ensure it, and none of the test injuries was life-threatening. We should note, however, that despite their criticisms, the automakers all told us they're either studying or currently conducting their own offset